Oh, documents. Documents are, in a way, really the core of Model UN, because that is what distinguishes us from, say, Oxford-style debate, where you're kind of debating for the sake of debating, rather than actually trying to come up with new and novel solutions to the issues you're debating. Now, in MUN, we essentially have four different kinds of documents. So the first one is position papers, which you create and submit before the conference. The second one is working papers. That's the documents that you have in the beginning of conferences. They eventually turn into draft resolutions within your conference. And, well, then you have amendments to change your draft resolutions. We'll dive into each of those within this quick video. But firstly, we're going to begin with position papers. Position papers are those documents that you create before the conference, and usually your chairs or conference organizers will let you know by when do you have to submit those, because you will be sending those to your chairs or upload them on some sort of conference management platform like MUN Command that we developed. But really it is for you a tool to kind of document your research and also lay the foundation for future speeches and documents such as those working papers we'll talk about later. Now, they usually consist of three key components. Firstly, you're going to describe the issue from your country's view or perspective. Secondly, you're going to provide sort of the key aspects within the issue or the topic that your country believes is really important. And then thirdly, you're going to be providing a little bit of an insight into what measures you believe, or your country rather, that will tackle the issue best, or that your committee should take in order to address the issue. Now, that is not necessarily a part that every delegate always includes, but that is such a valuable part, because those measures really get you thinking before the conference what you can do to improve the situation, and they also then build sort of the building ground that later on you can write a working paper on, or even looking way out in the future, a draft resolution. Okay. All right, next up, working papers. Working papers are really the first documents that you're going to be discussing in committee. First question, how do they come about? Well, you might just dream them up in committee as you're discussing possible solutions with your fellow delegates, maybe in an unmoderated caucus. Or you might have something prepared, or another delegate might have that sort of document prepared before the conference. Now, let's have a look at what those documents actually look like. And you see, there's no specific format. This is an example from some conference I attended. I don't even think, maybe I wrote it myself. I'm not even sure anymore. Anyway, you see that there is like numbers there, and there's some sort of structure to it, but that's just to make it look structured. There's no mandatory format to working papers, right? You can have just written out paragraphs, you can have bullet points, you can scribble beautiful pictures, although that really won't be any help in the future, so don't scribble too much. Anyway, this is what something like a working paper might look like, but you can be really open about what you make it look. What is important in a way, especially if you start preparing working papers for your conference, is to not make them look too similar to resolutions. Because obviously you want to prepare a working paper because you want to show that you really are a strong contender in your committee, and you want to not waste any time during the committee writing down ideas that you already had, and you want to not start just dreaming up ideas during the conference either. So you want to prepare something, but you want to make sure that what you have prepared is not so specific and in format so close to a draft resolution that your fellow co-delegates will feel like you're forcing your opinion on them. So really, strike that fine balance of being specific, so delegates will know you have concrete ideas, while it's not being too specific, so they feel like you're a bit trying too hard. Those are working papers. Finally, draft resolutions, the real meat of United Nations simulations. And draft resolutions really are just real resolutions that haven't been voted upon yet. And so here we are now looking at a real resolution of the United Nations Security Council. And compared to the working paper we looked at earlier, there's some formalities we have to respect. And those we will have to respect also in draft resolutions. So that format doesn't only get thrown at it when it becomes a formal resolution. You always have to respect that, even when you're handing in just a draft resolution. So let's look at what's happening here. There's just some formalities out here which we don't really care too much about. You can copy that whenever you're writing your own. really what's essential about resolutions is that they're divided essentially into two parts. The first part being preambulatory clauses, and then the second part being operative clauses. Now, the preambulatory clauses are not only very hard to pronounce, they also justify the action that you later take in the operative clauses. All right, let's have a look at one of those preambulatory clauses up here. Oh, there's no full stop here, and none here either. Well, that is because any resolution consists only of one very, very long sentence divided by commas, or as we later see, also semicolons. Now, what we also see, and that's what's really notable, is that we have those operating words in the beginning of each and every one of those clauses. We are going to share down below this video a list of exemplary ones that you can use for your resolution, but they just essentially introduce each and every one of those preambulatory clauses and those operative clauses. And they're also quite different between preambulatory. I'm just going to call them preamps from now on for simplicity's sake. They are quite different here than they are later on for operative clauses. We'll see more of that later. Preamps often, as I said, they justify the action you're taking. They're referencing all the resolutions. We talked about that also when we did our research. And they really go into also the situation that's at hand. They refer to things that other UN bodies have done, reports that might have been created, and so on and so forth. Now, really, they're not that important in MUN when you're writing a resolution. Let's be real. They are kind of important, but also at the same time, nobody really cares about them. You should still have them. And ideally, you'd have like essentially one for each operative clause, but generally, 5 to 10 of them are a good sort of guideline as you're writing a resolution. Anyway, they're more interesting for you as you're doing your research. And there you should definitely dig into and read all of them as you're doing research. Enough of those now, though. Let's head on to the operative clauses, which come way down below because this is a massive and important resolution which established a set of authorizations for the international community to enforce an arms embargo that was placed on Libya in 2016. And now we already see we're acting under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations. That is only something that's allowed for the Security Council. Right? So because here you're starting to violate essentially the sovereignty of certain nations, and you can't do that as like a General Assembly committee. I remember at my very, very first conference ever, I knew nothing about the UN. So I tried to impose sanctions and deploy peacekeepers in the Disarmament and International Security Committee of the General Assembly, and that wasn't possible because that's only Security Council territory. Anyway, this was a Security Council resolution, so that's all fine. We now see all those operative clauses. We see that they're numbered, first of all, and that is really important, so you can always refer back to them in great detail. We also see that those operators suddenly change because they're actually taken action. So we see condemns here, urges member state, decides to authorize. So that really gives you a tool also to sort of judge the severity and the intensity of your resolution. An operator could suggests that China decides to eat more broccoli. If you, however, urge China to eat more broccoli, that is a lot stronger of a wording, and will give your resolution a lot more weight. Anyway, we kind of see that going on all the details. We're not going to go into the content of this. As you're writing those operative clauses, there's a couple of things you should take note of, though. And this is really where it kind of gets difficult. How do you write international law? That's really difficult, isn't it? It's actually not that bad, Don't worry, it doesn't have to sound quite as amazing as all of this, armies of lawyers probably wrote this. Really, what you can do, though, is take some inspiration from this. You imagine you're implementing a no-fly zone, which I once did in a UN committee, actually a Security Council. I remember that in Libya they once had a no-fly zone implemented, so I just went back to that resolution, looked at that operative clause, and took some inspiration from that to write my own no-fly zone operative clauses. Easy. It's not really copycatting because you're just taking inspiration and making sure you're not forgetting anything. Now, other things, what I once was recommended by a chair to really write great operative clauses is to try to think of a couple of key questions. Firstly, how is whatever you're suggesting here, or take whatever measure you're taking here, how is that going to be implemented? when is it going to be implemented, where is it going to be implemented, and you also often want to still include the sort of why is it going to be implemented, right? For example, in this second operative clause here, member states of the United Nations are urged to combat terrorist acts by all means, and they're referring to them doing so under their obligations with international law of all sorts of diversity. Anyway, so this is really, again, going into the why you have to do it and referencing that. And the more specific you are in your operative clauses, the less vulnerable you will later on be to other delegates suggesting, oh, your resolution is weak. So that is usually the one thing that delegates like to attack in a resolution. They're going to be like, oh, it's weak, it doesn't do anything. If you are specific, that really takes away that sort of angle of attack. And you can, press on through, even though, sometimes actually a lot of text goes a long way, even though it doesn't necessarily take a lot of measures. Anyway, that is essentially how you write an operative resolution. You can also have subclauses. If we scroll down a little bit, maybe we're going to maybe we're going to find some of those. Doesn't appear to be the case. Doesn't really matter though too badly. So it's essentially then 12a, 12b, 12c. What's really important whenever you're writing such subclauses is that you still keep that essentially one long sentence kind of flow of writing, right? So it shouldn't feel like you're suddenly having a sentence in between. It should still all flow in terms of language. And then finally, decides to remain actively seized on the matter, and then you finally see that full stop. And you also see that operative clauses are separated by semicolons, whereas preambulatory clauses are separated with commas. Whew, that was a long and a complicated session. Anyway, just look at actual UN resolutions, enjoy and write your own resolution to combat whatever issue you're facing today. Whew, that was already 3 different types of documents. Firstly, we talked about position papers before the conference. We talked about working papers that turns of your rough ideas into actual measures, and where you build blocks with other people and other countries to really think about how can I improve the situation? And then you turned all of that into a draft resolution, or some other delegate might have done that. With the working papers, you might have a handful circulating within your committee, depending also on the size of the committee. With the draft resolutions, it's going to be fewer even. And now that you have a couple of draft resolutions introduced in your committee on the floor, it's time to think about whether you actually want to vote in favor or against that. Well, that is sometimes not that easy, because maybe you find part of a resolution amazing and the other part not that great at all. Maybe you want to add something, or there's that one operative clause you hate that much you want to just strike it out. Well, you can do that. And that is why we have a thing called amendments. Amendments are, well, changes to draft resolutions which you can make to them before your committee starts voting on them. Okay. Amendments are really a bit of a magical thing. You might be unfamiliar with amendments from the US Constitution. You have the Second Amendment, which allows people to carry arms. Not all amendments do that in MUN, but that was one of those changes to the US Constitution that only came on after the fact. And you can do exactly the same thing to draft resolutions in your committee. There it is really quite simple in that you can add to a resolution, you can remove operative clauses that you really hate, and you can change operative clauses that you just hate a little bit. So essentially you will just follow your chair's directions here. But essentially you can do all those things and really change the whole meaning of resolutions. And there will be a lot of those amendments after resolutions have been submitted. But it's always sort of a point where you have to gauge where you want to put your effort and your weight. Do you want to change a resolution, or do you want to just debate for killing it? Or not killing it, but just having a majority vote against it. It's really where you start to develop a sense for as you progress in your experience as a delegate. But amendments can be a really, really useful tool, and sometimes even they can turn a resolution completely around to a point where they don't mean at all anymore what they meant when they were created in the beginning. So that's it. We have position papers before the conference, we have working papers, we have draft resolutions, and we have amendments. Eventually, some resolution's going to pass or they're all going to fail. Either way, you've just completed your first conference Congratulations. We hope this little series of videos allowed you to really get more comfortable with Model UN and allowed you to have a nice and smooth first conference experience. We certainly hope you did. Now for your next conference, just hop on over to MUN where you can sign up for your next conference and maybe organize one someday. We're looking forward to seeing you there. Cheers.